Hey guys, welcome to Bethel Online. My name is Jason. I'm one of the pastors here, and we're so glad you decided to make us a part of your weekend. No matter who you are, where you come from, we're so glad you're here. Our vision is to be a safe place for real people to encounter the real Jesus and experience real change. Our hope and our prayer is that no matter who you are or what you've been through, you know that you are loved and you are wanted here. We would love to get to know you better and help you connect with all that's going on. You can do this by going to our website at www.bethel.us or by downloading the Bethel app. You can find our app by searching Bethel Putco in your app store. Both online and in the app, you can fill out digital connection card. It only takes a minute and it'll help us know how to serve you better. Another way you can connect today is through giving. Your generosity at Bethel directly impacts God's mission to radically change people's lives in Putnam County and beyond. Through the ministries of Bethel and the many local and regional organizations we support, people are able to see the grace of God and how much He loves them. You can always give on our website at bethel.us/give or in the Bethel app. Thank you for partnering with us and making a difference. Well, thanks again for tuning in online today. Know that you are wanted and welcome here, and you are loved. I hope you all have a great day.
Good morning and welcome to Bethel Online. Hey, this morning before we get started, I just want to celebrate something with you. If you consider Bethel your home or your local church family, or you consider yourself to be a part of Bethel, this morning at 10:30 at Deer Meadow, we're actually going to be able to baptize nearly 35 people. You still actually, if you're watching this at 9, or if you're watching this right at 10:30, and you're within a few miles, you can probably get in your car and make it to be a part of that. We would love to see you. We would love an opportunity to connect with you. If you feel like maybe that's your next step, we'd love to know so that we can walk you through your next step of faith. This morning's message is the final message in our series called Neglected Virtues. This message is for the person who has a place in life that you feel like giving up. Maybe you've been stuck in addiction, you've been fighting it, you've been trying to work through rehab, you've been trying to work through step programs. Maybe you're in the middle of a relationship that's just been a fight or a challenge for a long time. Maybe you've been trying to carry out something that God put on your heart, but you just keep running up against brick walls. Maybe this morning you're right elbows deep in the middle of parenting and it's really, really hard. And there are moments where you think about checking out of the game. Maybe you, like many people in our culture today, you're just struggling with the circumstances around your life and trying to find hope and trying to heal and to get to a place where you can dream again. And I just want to give you a message this morning to not give up. Hebrews chapter 10, verse 35 through 37 says, "Do not throw away your confidence." Now, this is being written to the early church. So apparently, even in the early church, with all of the things happening, the people coming to Jesus, all of the growth and the movement of Christianity that was happening in the day, apparently this needed to be said. Apparently people were beginning to waver. They were going through some challenges and some struggles. And the writer says, don't throw away your confidence. It will be richly rewarded. You need to persevere so that when you've done the will of God, you'll receive what He's promised. For in just a little while, He who is coming will come and not delay. So my friend, you need to persevere. That perhaps one of the lost virtues in our culture is the perseverance to continue on fighting for the relationship, fighting for the dream, working through the challenges. The reality is that following Jesus, beginning to follow Jesus, taking your first step is not the end step. That God calls us to not just experience salvation, but to also begin to experience life transformation. And so often transformation is hard. change is difficult. Fighting the battles are hard and challenging. Often perseverance will get us there, but it's easy along the way, isn't it, to run into some challenges and just feel like throwing in the towel. To say, you know what, I've tried, I've given it a shot. I've tried to do better, I've tried to live better, I've tried to do the right thing, but I'm running up against challenges. Even in the early days of faith, the people who were following Jesus wrestled with this perseverance of the persecution they were going through and the challenges that were in their hands. It says, you will receive what he has promised, that God keeps his promises and he keeps his word. And on verse 37, it goes on to say, in just a little while, he who is coming will come and will not delay. The reality is the early church was waiting for Christ to return the same way that God's people are waiting today. And apparently they were struggling with the fulfillment of the promise. The reality is, to them, it must have seemed like forever as they walked in the middle of challenges. It can feel that way sometimes. You can feel like seasons of life will never end. Seasons of challenges, difficulty, can feel like they're just never going to end. But in the scheme and the perspective of God, maybe the period of time we're in isn't as long as it seems to us. There's a story in the book of Joshua, the 6th book in the Old Testament, in the 6th chapter. It talks about God's people as they're nearing Jericho. They're nearing the gates of Jericho, which was going to be a key city for his people. And it says the gates of Jericho were tightly shut. They had arrived there. The city had been promised to them. They knew they needed the city as a people, but the gates were shut because the people there were afraid of God's people. Said no one was allowed to go in or out. And God has a conversation with Israel's people, the leader of Israel's people, and says to Joshua, I've given you Jericho, its king, and all of its strong warriors. It's interesting. In this moment, they have not yet taken Jericho as a part of God's plan. God is the only one capable of promising what is in the future, in the present. But God promises them that he's already made it happen. Now understand, God's people had been going along for a period of time. God's people had been trained up in war. They had fought one war after another as they headed towards the promise that God had given them. He says, you and your fighting men should march around the town once a day for 6 days. You have to understand, these trained fighters, these trained warriors were primed and ready for action. And God instructs them, rather than to jump into action or to go to war, he instructs them to just march around the town. Can you imagine what the thought was amongst these trained fighters, ready to, chomping at the bit, ready to fight, ready to go to war, as God basically instructs them to hold on and just stay around the city? He says 7 priests will walk ahead of the ark. The ark represented the presence of God with his people. And he says they will walk ahead carrying a ram's horn. On the 7th day, you're to march around the town 7 times with the priests blowing the horns. Now, what we know is that the walls around Jericho were very tall, but the city of Jericho was actually not that large. But the perspective of the people as they walked up must have been these immense walls. This immense challenge in front of them. He says, when you hear the priests give one long blast on the ram's horns, have all the people shout as loud as they can. Then the walls of the town will collapse and the people can charge straight into the town. Now, the end of the story is that the city's walls crumble. They are able to go in, overtake the city. God keeps his word and he keeps his promise. But can you imagine The exhaustion of the people, having been on the move for a long time, having fought battle after battle, being war-torn, tired, exhausted, maybe even hurting and in need. Staring at the walls that seem way bigger than they would have the ability to penetrate or break through. That there might have been a temptation in this moment amongst these brave warriors to say, you know what? I'm tired of fighting. Or to say, you know what? He wants us to march around, but we want to fight. The temptation to give up. Why do we give up after the promise of God? Why are we so tempted to give up in the middle of the struggle? Number one, I think we give up because our perspective is often limited. Remember, the people had these huge walls they were looking at. Their view of the city was these massive walls. But while the walls were massive, merely in an hour and a half, they could have walked the entire circumference of the city. But when you're up close to the problem, it's hard to have the 20,000-foot view. The truth for you and the truth for me is that God's perspective is often different than ours. He has the 20,000-foot view that involves you, and it involves all of those he loves, and it involves his story. And we often can only see the pile of bricks in front of us that seems like we can't pass over. We only see the situation with our power, versus the power of a God who's behind us. Our perspective is often so limited. While we fight the addiction, our perspective might see getting through the day as nearly impossible, while God has the capacity to set us free from the addiction. But our perspective can be so limited by what we've experienced, so limited by our faith. Number two, our progress isn't always obvious. Over the years, as I've worked with people elbows deep in addiction, as I've spoken to and worked with people who built businesses over time, I often hear about the time they got stuck or the time that they failed, and about how a near bankruptcy numerous times happened before they finally got the break, or how they were clean for 30 days and they became overconfident in themselves rather than confident in God. And that moment of arrogance led them to let down their guard and step back into the addiction. Rather than waiting for the person that God had promised for their life, there's just this temptation of loneliness to allow the wrong people in. Sometimes we're near the place God wants to take us, but we can't see the progress we've made. As a matter of fact, on their way to Jericho, God's people had overcome a lot of things. They had experienced a lot of things. God was putting things in place and placing leaders and warriors in place to be ready for the next step. But along the way, it must have felt like, isn't this going to happen soon? Why is it not happening sooner? And often, because our progress isn't always visible to us, we assume that there's been no progress. And maybe you've been fighting for a relationship for a long time, and it feels like you fall back into the same ruts and the same habits. And maybe you've been trying to train the child to be the person that you believe God wants them to be, but you're running up against resistance and you're tempted to just say, you know what, do your thing, kiddo. But instead, maybe you're making progress you don't realize. Maybe that God intends to use your effort in the lives of the child and the circumstances of the child to come to a point where God carries through on his promises. Stay in the game. It's so easy to want to throw in the towel with frustration. Maybe you're a person of faith, and for years you've had a heart for someone in your life that didn't know Jesus. This morning in our church, as we baptize 30-some people, I'd love to know the stories of all the people that have prayed for them along the way, have hoped for them to take this step, and the people who are literally seeing something come through today that maybe they never thought would, that maybe along the way they started to wonder, is God going to be faithful to my prayers? You see, our progress isn't always obvious. Often God allows us to be a part of something that He's doing. It's not as much about us as it is about what He's carrying out. Joshua had commanded his army there in Joshua chapter 6, verse 10, to not give a war cry or raise their voices. He said, don't say a word until the day I tell you to shout, then shout. I don't know fully why Joshua told them to do this, but I wonder, had they been able to talk amongst themselves? I wonder if the soldiers had said, what is up? Like, we're soldiers. Like, we told our family we're going to battle on their behalf. We told our people we're going to war. And here we are just marching around the city. Like, how are we going to get to where we're supposed to go if we're just walking around? But there was progress because God was going before the people. And our progress isn't always obvious because sometimes our perspective is jaded. I also wonder what negativity could have began to build up in the people where they begin to have those thoughts that are like, we're never going to take over Jericho. It's just not possible. We're tired, we're worn out, we're exhausted. Like, what if the people on the other side are bigger than us or more powerful than us? What if the challenge on the other side is bigger than us? And maybe the reason they didn't talk about it was because God was making progress on their behalf. It said, so he had the ark of the Lord carried around the city, circling it once. Then the army returned to camp and spent the night there for 6 days. So on the second day, they marched around the city once and returned to the camp. They did this for 6 days. You see, during this, these warriors were going to learn a lesson about God. I don't know about you, but I like to go at my pace. I like things to work on my plan and my timing. But the truth is that when we follow Jesus, his timing is so much more important than ours. That God is doing something out ahead of us. And often while God is going and doing something ahead of us, he's allowing something to happen in us before he does something for us. I think back to a couple years ago when we were right in the middle of a pandemic and we couldn't meet as a church because of restrictions, and we were meeting in the school, so we followed the school's guidelines, and it was a season where you couldn't really do anything right as a leader. If you went one direction, people were unhappy. If you went the other direction, we were unhappy. We had had some incredible years as a church, incredible years. God was doing a really incredible work, but I do remember wondering at times during that season, like, was that over? Like, even though God had put a dream in my heart and had begun to carry out this vision, I began to wonder if it was going to come to fruition. I wondered if our best days were behind us. I wondered if my best days were behind me. If maybe I just didn't get it anymore. Maybe I was missing something, or maybe I was going to have to figure something else out. Like I just was in a difficult place. And I think most leaders felt that during that season of just not being sure of what to do and just the general division in the culture. But what I know now is that the things God was carrying out during that season would bring us to this point today, where it's very possible that by the end of the week, we will baptize more people in one day than ever any one day in the history of this church. God was moving things we couldn't see in a time in which we just felt blinded by the challenges ahead. Rather than to throw in the towel, we needed to keep focus on what God had called us to. Same's true in your life. While you may not see the progress and you may not have the perspective that gives you hope, God is faithful to keep his promises. And maybe it's time for the second stint in rehab. Maybe it's time to humbly listen to your friends or the right people, to humbly listen to wisdom in your life, to surround yourself with some people. Maybe it's time to trust that even though you're in the middle of the battle or you're kind of in the middle of a stuck moment, that what you see isn't everything that's going on, and that there is a God who, like for the Israelite people, had a great promise for them. Maybe the same is true for you, and maybe progress is being made that you can't see in the life of your child. Maybe progress is being made in your marriage just by the fact that you're choosing to stay. In a recent study of kids with similar IQ levels in a national spelling competition by Scripps Howard, they looked back historically at the kids who had been in that event, and they said there's very little difference in the IQ levels of the kids who qualify for the National Spelling Bee. And that some of them go on to achieve incredible things while others seem to struggle. And they begin to look through and try to divide out, was it education? Was it socioeconomic things? Was it home structure that made the difference in who seemed to fly according to society standards or who seemed to struggle? What they found was the trait of perseverance tends to be the one that most determined the success level of those children. May we be a people with great perseverance. You see, because often God is doing something in you before He does something for you. And you can be so close to the place. Listen, God's people were literally knocking on the door of the city. They were literally right there in the place God intended to take them. They were just outside the wall. What if they had turned around or said, maybe we'll just set up somewhere not far from here? They would have missed what God had for them. Hebrews 10:36 says this: you need to persevere so that when you have done the will of God, you'll receive what He has promised. Stay in the game, my friends. Galatians 6:9 says, let us not become weary in doing good, for at the proper time we'll reap a harvest if we do not give up. When you feel like giving up, stay in the game. Remember God's promises. Trust in His provision. He's making a way where there seems to be no way. I love you, Bethel. Have a great week.
Hey, thanks so much for watching. Are you ready to take your next step? We would love to hear from you. You can send an email to hello@bethel.us. You can send us a message on Facebook, or you can let us know in the Bethel app. And speaking of the Bethel app, take a moment, if you haven't already, to go to your app store and search Bethel Putco to download our app. There's all kinds of great resources in the app. You can listen to messages, you can view the messages from Sunday morning, and you can also fill out a digital Connect card. You can do that today and each week to let us know that you're tuning in. You can also find some great information about our Bethel Kids Ministry and our Be the One student ministries. Also in the app, you can give. It's one of 3 ways you can give: with online giving at bethel.us/give, in our app, Bethel Putco, or through text. Hey, thanks again for joining us. We hope you have a great day and know that you are loved.